For the ordinary people of the Arab world, especially the population, the huge young population of the region, the Arab Spring, as it's come to be known, is simply the most significant reform movement in the region in their lifetime. And what I want to do today, in the course of my talk, is pose the following question. How have events of the Arab Spring changed the strategic and security paradigm in the region? In the course of looking at that, I want to focus on four major powers in the region: the United States and Saudi Arabia, Iran, the anti-status quo power, and China, an increasingly important actor in the region. The first is the socio-economic security paradigm. The second is the role of external actors, in this case the United States and China. The third is the role of Saudi Arabia in the context of the Arab Spring. Arab Spring was primarily important in terms of the socio-economic impact and the way events on the ground have impacted on thinking about socio-economic issues. Now, the first point I would make is that the GCC countries, the 6 members of the GCC, benefited from the rising price of oil that was a consequence of the turmoil in Bahrain and Tunisia and Egypt and Libya. But having said that, the Arab Spring highlighted 5 issues that are going to have significant strategic consequences in the medium to long term. Historically, the higher the oil price, the more stable the region was. But for the first time, you have a high oil price and increased instability. Point 2, spending to buy loyalty in the Gulf Cooperation Council countries. The third issue I think that the Arab Spring has taught us is that poverty is not alone sufficient to explain regime collapse. The GCC countries are among the richest on a per capita basis in the world. China supported the March of 2011 Security Council resolution on Libya, Resolution 1973. And this was interpreted as a new departure in Chinese foreign policy in the Persian Gulf. Third significant change or significant factor is the role of Saudi Arabia. The Arab Spring had great implications for the GCC's future development and for the Saudi Arabian role inside the GCC. So emboldened Saudi Arabia as a leader of the proxy war against Iran in the Middle East. In conclusion, as I call it here, the Arab Spring has resulted in a not-so-new regional reality. There is no real change to the regional strategic balance of power, but there are a few potential possibilities that are consequences of events in the last year. The first is Saudi Arabia has achieved a significant success in preventing regime change in Bahrain. That the 2 dominant powers in the GCC are Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Qataris are deeply tied up with Iran. Iran thrives on instability in the region. If you look at China, it has little interest in playing the role of strategic balancer in the region. On a strategic level, China views the United States as its most important ally in the Gulf. Not Saudi Arabia, not Qatar, not Iran. So I would argue in conclusion that the Arab Spring has not yet altered the region's strategic balance of power. Thank you very much.
My paper today is entitled Contesting the Arab Spring, Tribal Order and Revolution in Yemen. We can identify 3 main paradigms by which we can actually understand the so-called Arab Spring. And these 3 paradigms of change are as follows. First of all, regime stability through repression, which I refer to as the Tiananmen model. The second paradigm we can look at in terms of the wider change in the Arab world is the so-called Turkish model. That's the gradual diminishing role of the military. We see transitional governments in Tunisia and Egypt where the military remains still the power behind the scene. The third paradigm, the so-called targeted patronage measures. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has had a history of throwing money at political problems. Well, first of all, the unrest in Yemen predates the Arab Spring. Yemen is and remains a tribal state, and politics in Yemen is determined by competition over the tribal field. So therefore, patronage politics has always dominated the political process between the centre and the periphery. Therefore, in the case of Yemen, we need to make the distinction between the government on the one hand and the regime on the other. So what we actually have in terms of determining tribal politics and indeed politics in Yemen is a patron-client relationship. The Yemenis are also facing ecological deprivation. If one looks at water supplies in Yemen, Sana'a, it is said, is likely to become the first dry capital since Salt Lake City. In other words, it is running out of water. Now, Sean Joyce, who was head of national security at the FBI, said, and I quote, "In my opinion, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is a more imminent threat, is a greater threat than the core Al-Qaeda." I think there are four main elements that mark out Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. The first is that its ambition remains global in terms of its targets, and it is technically creative. Secondly, up and until recently, it had a master of propaganda who could convey the message of AQAP across the internet. Thirdly, its modus operandi inside Yemen has been marked more by the use of small arms, that is, rifles and small bombs, to assassinate Western diplomats and security and intelligence officials in the south of the country. And more importantly, we now have evidence to suggest that in order to shore up their position in Yemen, that members of Al-Qaeda have been trying to marry in to the various tribes in the south of the country. It is relatively easy for Al-Qaeda to gain access to weapons and to move across the relatively porous borders and open waterways that surround Yemen. The Americans have come to regard Ali Abdullah Saleh as part of the problem. Now, many opposition leaders in Yemen have privately said to the Americans that they would actually be happy for airstrikes and drone strikes to continue to take place against Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. I would argue that if the West wants things to change in Yemen, it has to operate through the most effective means of political exchange in Yemen, and that is the tribes. Failure of policymakers to think otherwise can only invite the conditions for wider violence and now threaten to shape its immediate future. Thank you very much.
やっぱり私たちがその中東イスラム世界の情勢を見る際にですね、どうしてもその見落としてしまうのが部族じゃないかなという気がしました。アフガニスタンであるとか、ソマリア、中央アジアもそうですけども、部族というものが果たす社会的役割というのはですね、イエメンの事例を見ても重要かなという感じがしました。外国を直接ターゲットにするイスラム過激派というのはイエメンのアラビア半島のアルカイダぐらいかなという、そんな印象ですね。私たち、日本もですね、戦略的なその思考を持って、今のその中東のその現状を考えなきゃいけないんじゃないかなという気がします。日本の利益あるいは日本人の利益にとって重要なところに重点的にその支援を与えていく、中東外交というとやはり、資源外交、あるいはそのエネルギー安全保障というのは日本にとっては非常に重要かと思います。よく当たり前のことですけども、日本のエネルギーの90% は中東からペルシャ湾岸から買っているわけでありまして、そこでのその安定をいかに保つかということは日本にとって非常にクルーシャルといいますか重要なことであると思います。そのためのその努力あるいは国際的な責任というものをですね、日本はこれからも果たしていかなきゃいけないんじゃないかなという気がします。